Hello, everyone. A warm welcome to this Blackbird.AI webinar. Thanks for joining us today for this conversation about navigating the challenges of today's complex information environment, and specifically how to defend our publics against cognitive warfare. My name is Larysa Lacko, and I am with Blackbird. I am the director of our national security accounts. We're just going to wait a few more minutes for our guests to arrive, but just a few housekeeping rules while we wait. A quick note on format. So this is an interactive session. Please feel free to drop your questions into the chat at any time. Your questions actually help guide what we prioritize in future webinar sessions, so please keep them coming. Really excited today as we're joined by leaders from academia and civil society, and I will be moderating and sharing a perspective from the technology side at Blackbird AI. Today, we'll discuss the modern information environment, the vulnerabilities that are being exploited, and also we'll talk about ways to defend against attacks in the cognitive domain. So I'm very excited to introduce our speakers today. First, Andrea Hickerson from the Center for Information Advantage and Effectiveness at the University of Mississippi. She's also the dean and a professor at the Journalism and New Media faculty at the university. And the center, it's an interdisciplinary research hub that focuses on understanding how information circulates online and how public and private organizations decide if, when, and how to respond. And so this work blends together research, media insight, and real-world advisory support. And we're also very excited to have Pablo Breuer from the DISARM Foundation. DISARM is an independent open source organization that helps governments, institutions, and civil society detect and counter influence operations. So they maintain the DISARM Framework, which you may have heard about. This is a shared global model that maps how information manipulation campaigns operate and what countermeasures are effective. So thank you so much for being here, both of you. And first, I just wanted to set the stage and, talk about how we characterize today's information environment that we're operating today. And I wanted to start with you first, Andrea, drawing on your years of research and also your experience directing the center. In your view, how has the confluence of AI-generated content and hyper-personalized media fundamentally changed the dynamics of public communications? And in your view, what are the challenges that we are confronted with today as a result of this new environment that we're operating in?
Well, great. Thank you for having me here. It's a really great question to start because if we're talking about media and the internet, we're really only talking about just a little bit more than 25, 30 years, right? And a lot has changed. So when I started doing academic research, a lot of the attitude about the internet and online communication was celebratory. And now people are going to be able to write their own narratives and break power structures and contribute to new things and be very subversive. And I look back on that and it makes me cringe a little bit, even looking at some of my early work that was like, oh, everything is new and minorities will have this voice and can do their work. I did a lot of work on the Kurdish population. And so for them, that was where I started, about them creating their own identity. But, like a lot of traditional communication, like newspapers and organizations, they were slow to adapt to online. Like they didn't really believe that it would have any traction. So early, what we saw is organizations just taking their existing practices and putting them in a digital space. So the phrase I always like is shovelware, right? If you're a newspaper, you just put your articles in the same format that I looked in print and put them online. So they didn't really embrace the fully interactive space there. So what happened is with organizations not using digital media in a really creative way, it did open up the way for other opportunities to grow and big tech to really take over the narrative in a way that we were a bit naive looking back 25, 30 years ago. And so what we see is a frequency of communication that's much higher. And we see kind of unstratified actors, but we don't know who they are, and that's really new as well. And what this has done is it's created a lot of chaos from the consumer perspective as well, is that you see things in a stream of news, right? Where you might see something credible next to something that's not credible. It's delivered to you by a kind of black box AI. So you don't know what choices are being embedded and how that content gets to you. And as a consumer and a member of the public, it's confusing, and you can approach that in several ways. And some people say, oh, it's great, I control what I'm doing. There might be an allusion to that. Or you give up, right? And that's, I think, the sad thing is people think it's just so chaotic out there. I'm going to sit it out. And so I think in that mess is how do we make sense, particularly those working in with the public in mind, is how do we make the public make sense of what they're seeing, even if it doesn't make sense anymore?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a fascinating point. I think, the sort of sad end result of publics feeling apathetic about, what they're reading and what they're seeing online. And I think that is, you mentioned actors, actors who we don't know who are operating in this space. I think we know that this is also sometimes one of the goals that they're trying to achieve, right? Overwhelming our populations with the amount of information that is out there, conflicting information that is out there in order to exhaust the audience, right? You mentioned a number of different challenges that we're seeing, the frequency of content that is being posted, the speed, and this sort of gives us a fertile ground, right, for actors to operate in. So I wanted to turn it over to you, Pablo, and ask you about, these vulnerabilities that we're talking about that result from the modern information environment. How are they being exploited by hostile actors? And what are some of the ways that we could use AI to better defend ourselves and our publics in this space?
No, that's a great question. I'm just going to reemphasize some of the great points that Andrea made. So, um, if you were an American in the 1980s, right, your choices for news were pretty much, ABC, CBS, and NBC. And so you would listen to the broadcast and you would agree with it or disagree with it. But when you went to go talk to your neighbor about what was going on in the world, you had this shared view of what was presented. And then you could have that civil discourse about, well, I agree with this, or I don't agree with this, or I've got a different way to look at it. But that's how we solve problems in a democracy is, evaluating kind of our shared view of the world and picking out the differences. So what happens with social media and with the internet is we get a lot more choices, but those choices come at a cost, and the cost is that there are some funny cognitive things that happen with people. So one of the first things is that people tend to believe that, they're in the majority. So, more people believe what I believe than don't believe, which is why you get things like, 85% of Americans think they're above average drivers. And you go, well, that's not really the way the math works, right? Like 50% have to be above average and 50% have to be below average. Um, but what happens is that now when you're, listening to a particular branch or a particular channel, um, you only get that narrow view, and everybody that listens to that channel has similar biases. And so you don't get the outside view and the outside perspective. And what's worse, if you take, two media channels, and I'll just pick two at random. If you take, CNN and Fox News, and you talk to viewers of CNN and viewers of Fox News, there's no overlap in the coverage. And so there's no common ground for them to have that civil discourse. And therefore, we can't solve problems in the democracy. Um, One of the two interesting things. The first one is, with the emergence of LLMs and Gen AI and deepfakes and those things, we spent a lot of time talking about how AI can be used to harm and propagate mis and disinformation. Um, and there's some truth to that, but what I would say is the bigger harm was caused way before Gen AI, and it was when the algorithms decided what you were going to see on social media, right? And so it sticks you in this echo chamber where now we hyper radicalize because literally everything you see is driven by your own echo chamber and your own biases. And so you don't get that outside view, and it really takes advantage of that cognitive part. Um, So I think that there's a lot of things that can be done with AI to kind of help us, examine that. One very simple thing is there's this political science concept. I'm not a political scientist, but it's called the Overton window. And the Overton window for any particular topic, there's a range of things you can say across the spectrum, right? Some of those things you can say in polite company, some of those things you cannot, right? So if you're talking about illegal immigration, for instance, you can say in polite company, well, there should be a path to citizenship. You could say in polite company, well, these people are here legally. They should be sent back to where they came from. What you can't say is these are lizard people from the planet Venus and they should all be, lined up and like, sunk in the bottom of the ocean. You can't say those things in polite company. Um, so one of the things you could do is if you were on social media as you're reading things, it would be really great if social media would provide you an Overton window and go, listen, the things that you're viewing right now are here in the Overton window, or they're way outside the norms of what most people are seeing. And so just that awareness of, oh, most people don't believe what I do. I am way outside the standard deviation for normal views on this. Just that little bit of awareness might lead people to go, well, maybe I need to do some more reading. So a little bit of self-awareness goes a very long way.
So is the Overton window meant to provide context around the claim that's being posted online? Or could you share more light on that?
Yeah, so what it provides is not necessarily context on the view itself, but it provides context on where you are relative to the rest of the discussions happening in general society, right?
Okay.
And so just the awareness of, hey, I'm a little bit to the right of what most people are talking about, or I'm a little bit to the left of where most people are talking about. I think that's great, right? Like again, that's how we solve problems in democracy. I think where it would be really helpful is if, all of a sudden you realize, wow, I'm way outside the norms of what most people are discussing. And just that little bit of awareness of my beliefs are really out of line with what most people in polite society think, however you want to define that, I think would go a long way to self-awareness that I'm in an echo chamber and I need to get out of this echo chamber.
Communication, we have a similar model to the Overton window that comes from Daniel Hallen in the context of the Vietnam War. But it's kind of that same thing, right? There's the sphere of consensus is kind of the inner circle, and then the sphere of controversy, which is like the larger circle, and then the sphere of deviance, right? And I think that's the same thing, is that these are outside the normal circles. And so that's a really great point.
Have you done some research around that, Andrea?
Not in a while. I mean, mostly, I think a lot of the research from this era focuses on traditional media, and not so much in this digital space. And part of that is because for researchers, it's very difficult for them to get samples from the digital space that they can work with like they're used to, right? So a lot of the research on consensus and controversy is looking at what public officials say, and looking in traditional media as people believe what public officials say. Even if you look at any news organization, the way they demonstrate legitimacy and trust to their audience is by quoting public officials, right? So it's showing that they're doing the official narrative, which is, you can see, kind of a double-edged sword. One, it's a way to show legitimacy, but if the actors, your official actors, are, speaking in the sphere of deviance, right, that shifts the whole circle a little bit. So I think that's a very fruitful area of research. And again, it's just harder now because of all the digital space. How would you grab a sample and, who is the public if I see something different than Pablo than you?
Can I hop in on one more thing there? Because this is really important. So when you look at kind of the evolution of information technologies, right? When you go from, the written word to the Gutenberg press to the Marconi radio to the television, up until the internet, the movement was a small group of gatekeepers talking to an ever broader audience faster and faster, right? So even in the 1980s, I talked about ABC, CBS, and NBC. I couldn't just show up at my local CBS affiliate and go, well, I'd like to talk to my town, or I'd like to talk to my state or my country. So one of the things that the early internet pioneers were trying to do is give everybody access to, the larger audience. So the good news is it worked, and the bad news is it worked, right? And so the reason I say the bad news is, I'll go back to the classic, First Amendment of, well, you can't scream fire in a crowded theater. Well, you actually can, right? But then everybody can turn around and go, well, Pablo, you yelled fire in a crowded theater and there was no fire and I can be held accountable. On the internet, nobody knows who you are, right? There's that meme about, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And there's a lot of truth to that. One of the things that we've seen over and over and over again is when you see disinformation, and by disinformation, I mean information that is intentionally false in either content or context. When you see disinformation, almost invariably, what you see is the poster of that information, the originator of that information misrepresents who they are. And so that's kind of one of the challenges that's come about with the internet. It's great that, you know, bloggers can, go out and publish without having to get necessarily approval for the New York Times, but that comes with a little bit of risk. And so we as consumers really have to be careful about what do I know about this person that's posting this and the origin of this information, and do I trust them?
Really, that's a really important angle, and I think we can discuss a little bit more in the webinar today on some of the goals that these hostile actors are trying to achieve, in this broader context and with our publics. Staying on this point of using AI for defense, and I know, Pablo, with your work with the DISARM Foundation, you folks have created your open source framework. I don't know if there's any sort of AI work that has gone into that, but I think, this line of effort to try to map adversarial activities and maybe try to gather some more evidence about who is sitting behind those accounts, that kind of work. I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit.
Sure, I can talk about that. So first, a very minor clarification. So the DISARM framework explains how mis and disinformation attacks happen. It doesn't tell you what is mis and disinformation, right? That's really left to, the analyst and the consumer. So I often get challenged about, what makes you qualified to decide what is and what isn't true. And I say, I don't. Here's the framework. You get to decide for yourself. Yeah. When you take a look at the four phases of a disinformation operation, according to DISARM, the four phases are planning, preparation, execution, and evaluation. And when you look at those, really, there's a good place for defenders to use AI in preparation, execution, and evaluation. And most of it really comes down to being aware of the massive amounts of information that are crossing on the internet and which themes are emerging and which themes are not emerging. So sentiment analysis is really wonderful. It's a great use of AI just for analysts to be able to take a look at. Now, what you want to be careful of as a defender is, if you're going to put yourself out there as the, shining knight in spotless armor, the minute that you use AI to create content, people are going to go, well, that's fake content. So that is not a good use. Using bots to proliferate information, even if it's true, is not a good use. It seems disingenuous. And so those are bad uses, but really for keeping track of what's going on social media, looking at emerging trends, seeing the way that the Overton window is growing or shrinking or shifting, really doing mass analysis of sentiment are great uses for AI. And so some of that has been used. It's been used by various research industries, both in the U.S. And in Europe. It was certainly used to keep track of emerging narratives in last year's European elections. It was used for looking at attitudes towards vaccines in Africa by the World Health Organization. And so it definitely can be used in very meaningful ways, but it has to be done carefully.
The challenges that we face in our different communities is when we're mapping these adversarial tactics that are being used, how are we sharing that information with each other? And are we speaking the same language? And I know that this is one of the purposes of the DISARM framework is to have this common language, common taxonomy that we could use in order to compare apples with apples, right? And if we're going to be, dividing up, this work and taking different parts of the elephant, we want to be able to make sure that we can come together and share this information and make sure that we can actually collectively take responses with it. I'm wondering, Andrea, you being in academia and the research that you do, is this a challenge that you're sort of grappling with, or do you have any views on having this more communal approach to analyzing adversarial activity?
Absolutely. I can talk about the context. So I've been working on deepfake detection for journalists for a few years with collaborators in computer science and in philosophy. And so we have a new book out called Fake Checking. And I don't know that we break new ground. I think the biggest contribution of our book is to say that there's a history of manipulated media, and this is just the next thing of where we are, right? I mean, a journalist, I think they're good proxies for how we should start to interpret this chaotic media environment because they have to make choices and they have to look at the context. Sometimes journalists have beats, so they have an awareness to say, like, that just doesn't look right because of the context, or that is not something that person would say, right? And so when a journalist decides if they're going to even acknowledge a deep fake or report it as a deep fake or something, that's not the sole emphasis of what they're looking on, right? They're looking at the larger story and thinking about how to communicate that with the public. However, our work has also exposed a lot of different skill sets that are needed in this space and some that are even lacking for journalists, right? So, for example, this crossover to Pablo, some of the journalists will say, well, I'm only going to use an open source tool because that is transparent. Well, you can't do that in the security context. It's like, here's how I made my deepfake, go make a better one, right? So that's not plausible in this situation. So it's explaining to journalists why that might not work for them. And then they have to explain to the public about why this AI tool that they're using has influenced their decision making. And that is really tricky to do. So one thing we're doing with the new center is really interested in different investigative practices across professions. So would a journalist approach a digital investigation the same way someone working in national security would approach it? What are the data sets? What are they looking for? So we're interested in that. And then also, I think, one thing I think is an open question is how much does the actor matter, right? The source of the negative material, right? When is that wasted activity, and when is it you're just looking for volume in the sphere that's what matters, or you're looking at, okay, who is having a conversation about this? So I think too we have to better educate people about what matters in this space, and again, they're all just indicators about how you could take a holistic view about whatever the topic or situation might be.
That's a great point, and I actually want to drill into that a little bit about knowing when to respond and knowing which activities surpass our risk thresholds and which ones don't, right? Um, we often hear this saying, if there's a narrative out there that's, it's gaining a little bit of traction, you don't want to give it too much oxygen by responding, so you ignore it. Like, what do those thresholds and risks look like to you? Maybe starting with you, Andrea, and then we'll go to Pablo.
Yeah, I think for me, I would start asking myself, what is at stake if this is out there, right? And I think that can keep things in perspective. And it's the same thing about gossip in the workplace, right? Like you hear these things out there, but when do you address it or not? It's just at a much larger scale, right? And I think that's where knowing, okay, where is this conversation being had? Because if we go back to the Overton window or the sphere of deviance, if it's out there, then it might not be worth addressing. But if it's something that's incorrect factually and it's shifting from the sphere of controversy to like the sphere of consensus, I would argue that there's something much more at stake there. So I think that's it. And I think that's hard to tell is what matters. And I don't think we have a good grasp on how much the digital ecosphere is a representation of public opinion, right? And I think that's what makes it super challenging. And that's why bots matter. So knowing if that's shared by a bunch of bots. So volume is really not a good indicator here. All of those types of things start to matter.
Yeah, and just to make things even more complicated, on the topic of bots, even when we determine, something has bot-like activity, which is something that we specialize in at Blackbird. Oh, we're seeing some bot-like activity. These bots are posting in a very quick frequency. They don't have a lot of followers. Assessing the impact of that is hard as well, right? So we might say, oh, these are bots, so maybe they don't matter as much. They don't represent public opinion. However, we also have to look at, how many people are actually seeing that content in their feed, whether or not they're engaging with it. It could also have an impact on their opinion. So, unpacking all of that really kind of requires the interdisciplinary approach that I guess, you're pioneering at the center, with social scientists and folks who specialize in assessing propaganda, et cetera. Um, but I also wanted Pablo to have a chance to answer this question as well around risks and determining what needs a response and what doesn't.
Yeah, no, that's actually like the question to ask right now, and it really depends on who you are as an organization. So, if you're the U.S. government, for instance, Bruce Schneier wrote these fantastic papers at Harvard on, the pillars of democracy and what information is critical for democracies to succeed and what pillars are necessary for autocracies to succeed. And so, for example, if you're the U.S. government, anything that challenges the legitimacy of your elections is something that critically must be defended against. And just like cybersecurity, doing a little bit of planning goes a long way. Doing a little bit of self-analysis for your organization and going, what are the narratives that are really, bad for us? So if you're a global conglomerate, right, selling a product throughout the world, if there's a false narrative out there that says that you self-reported a bunch of migrant workers is really bad for you, right? Because where those migrant workers came from, you're selling that product, right? If you're, just in the United States, right, and you're a local mom and pop shop, that may not be one worth fighting for you. So you really have to decide which of the battles worth fighting, which of the battles not worth fighting, and that's why corporate America has corporate communications, right? Talk to corporate communications, talk to the lawyers, right? Talk to your senior leadership, your C-suite, and figure those things out. Tabletop exercises go a very long way. And going back to your prior point about why did we do disarm? Well, I just mentioned core communications, legal. Hey, this happens on the internet. So at some point, your CISO, your CTO, your CIO are going to be drug into this. Well, we all speak very different languages, right? So we need that common language, and that's really why we wrote DISARM, is so that academics and legal scholars and lawyers and technical people, and this is not a silver bullet problem, this is a thousand bullet problem. Everybody in society needs to get involved, but in order to communicate effectively, we have to use language that everybody understands. And so that's why we do that. That's why OpenCTI has actually integrated Disarm into their tool, so we can share cyber threat intelligence as long as mis and disinformation intelligence. That's why Oasis Open has taken on the DAD CDM, Defense Against Disinformation Common Data Model, which is going to formalize into Stix and Taxi and all other cyber threat intelligence tools, disarm objects so we can share information about mis and disinformation threats and just be generally aware of what's going on.
Yeah, definitely. And, having this shared taxonomy and shared data models, like this is the way we can bring all of our little puzzle pieces together to get that aggregate view of the threat. And I know I'm familiar with some of OpenCTI's work, and it's very exciting that they've integrated Disarm. And I know that this is being used by a lot of governments across Europe, for example. So really supportive of that also from the Blackbird side. Um, you both have spoken a little bit about countermeasures to take, right? And I think there's two parallel lines of effort, right? There's the proactive work that needs to be done day to day, and then there's the reactive work. And on the proactive side, it's the combination of, you know, proactive communications from our government institutions to build trust. It's public-private partnerships, this information sharing, whole of society work that needs to take place. And then in addition to that, there's making sure that we're able to actually contest in the information environment, right? And to be able to respond quickly to threats that we see are surfacing. All of this, though, requires collaboration across communities. And I know it's something that we talk about so much that needs to happen, but something that's a bit difficult to put into practice. And I'm wondering, maybe starting with you, Andrea, from your point of view, what are some of the hurdles that you think we're facing to really building those trusted relationships across communities so we can actually start working together on this problem set. And not to say that there hasn't been work done. There's been a lot of work, I think that's been government led or civil society led, led by the media. community, but how can we make those relationships more trusted and improve the work that we're doing together?
Sure. So one really interesting thing I've noticed is the way that we use the word adversary in adversarial relationships, right? So if you look at it from the cybersecurity perspective, it means something really prescribed, someone that's like trying to engage with you directly. But if we look at the journalism context, we focus on the adversarial relationship the press has with the government, right? So it's very different in that case. And so I'd like to challenge that relationship. And I think if we're really focusing on the public, we have to question what that means. It doesn't mean giving different sides a free pass, right? But if we are both working in the public interest, as we should in a democracy, as we should with the highest standards of the media, we need to act like that and not just say, well, they're trying to ask me gotcha questions, right? And I know this is a huge ask, but that is very much the frame of what is going on, even in public discourse. But if we're trying to solve a problem and you want the public to know this is a real threat to your community, you have to have a relationship between the organizations and the people that still have audiences. And traditional news organizations still have audiences. They have legacy trust. And so that relationship, I think, has to change completely. But we're not quite there yet, because I think local news in particular is a huge national security problem, potentially. So the public still has trust in local news. But there's not a lot of funding for local news, right? Local news doesn't have a lot of resources to cover national events. So they're very vulnerable, right? If someone wants to slip then mis or disinformation, they are not prepared, often local newsrooms, to investigate a deep fake or something. In my research, when we would ask people, to participate in our work, a lot of local journalists said, well, this isn't going to impact me in my job. I don't think I can really help you. And if a deep fake comes to me, we think the New York Times is probably going to catch it first. No, if you're an adversary, you're going to go for the weak spot and you're going to send it to the paper most likely to present it, right? And so I think it's creating an awareness of all these vectors and who actually is our adversary in a democracy.
Yeah, that is an excellent point. And I think, it's interesting, this term cognitive warfare. I think sometimes warfare can be a bit misleading, right? Because it makes you think that cognitive warfare is waged through military strength, but it targets the most vulnerable parts of society, right? And I think, this is a great example of, yes, local news journalists, being targeted. We have to do a better job, definitely, of understanding, who our real partners are in this space, who we need to build those trusted relationships with, and what are we fighting for, right?
Not surprisingly, again, Andrea like nailed all the points. I want to point out that, in the 80s, when HIV and AIDS were a thing and it was very, very scary, the Russian government actually planted a story in an Indian paper that AIDS was created by the CIA and leaked out of Fort Detrick, Maryland. Tell me if you've heard this one before. Um, and then about a year later, a Russian newspaper printed the story, citing the story in the Indian newspaper. And that got such widespread coverage that it ended up with Dan Rather, who, by all accounts, is a respected journalist, reporting on the nightly news that there were indications that HIV/AIDS was a biological weapon that um, leaked out of Fort Detrick, Maryland. Of course, we all know that that's completely false, but just goes to highlight that, you target something small and then you use that as a reference in ever more trusted pieces of information. The other thing that I'll say is that, and this goes back to Andrea's previous point about, shovelware, where we're taking our existing product and we're shoveling it on the internet. It used to be that, when we had physical papers, right, usually on the first page or on the second page, there would be retractions and corrections that were posted, right? And so if you read, I'll pick one at random, if you read the New York Times today and it said something, tomorrow when you got the edition, they would correct something that they said, but you would get that correction. The problem with the internet is if you publish something on the internet, and then you print a retraction on the story, right? I've already read that story. I'm not going to go back tomorrow and click on that link again, so I'm not going to see the retraction. And so we have to find a way to kind of fix that. The other thing is that, again, it's almost a meme about the journalist running in last minute going, stop the presses, and having this new story. But at the speed of the internet, journalists are going to get things wrong. right? And it's not by intent. Sometimes, they show a clip of video, and the clip of the video isn't actually attached to the story, right? It's something, so they'll talk about an attack in Syria, and then they'll show you footage, and the footage is actually of, U.S. forces doing training with European counterparts in Europe, and they just got the context wrong.
Mhm.
That's going to happen. So we have to find a better way to kind of print those retractions and make sure that the audience sees those retractions. And so that's really challenging.
Did you want to speak a little bit more, Andrea, about, equipping journalists to help protect the integrity of the information environment and any work that your center does in that regard?
Sure. I think it's a real challenge point for journalism education. So, after education, it's really through public journalism that people learn, right? We're public educators. And so I'm concerned that education has to make a hard turn to educate people that understand the basics of AI so they can communicate to the public what the risks are, how the information is to use it. And this is just, not to get into the nitty-gritty of higher ed, but we're not really good at that because a lot of times AI is sitting in computer science, right? And so creating these kind of interdisciplinary expertise doesn't always work with the structure of a university. And so we're trying through this sensor. And I think because the University of Mississippi is not a traditional engineering school, it's enabled us a little bit to put that in a more interdisciplinary space from the beginning, about figuring out how can we use all these disciplines to come up with a skill set or a general education that tells people what's at stake with AI. And it doesn't mean coding. Like the trend 5, 10 years ago was every journalist needs Python. I think we're past that now and more of into the dynamic space, like what are the behaviors that we should be looking for? And then how can we ask good questions that tell the public what's going on?
I would challenge professional journalists with two things, and these are two changes that I've seen just because I'm old, right? So um, it used to be when you watched the nightly news, they would report the news, and then whatever anchor it was, the last 3 minutes, the broadcast, they would then editorialize. But there was a clear break between reporting the news and editorializing. I think regardless of where you get your news these days, it's very, very hard to see that hard break, and they intermix editorializing with the reporting of the news. I think that that's a disservice. That's a disservice to the truth, and we should be better about that. The other thing that we need to do is we need to, I think, as a society, come back and figure out what is a professional journalist and what do we require a professional journalist to do and not do. And so we see bloggers with press passes, right? Some of these bloggers are really fantastic. Some of them not so much, right? And so, you know, do we really want to treat them the same? Is the discussion that we need to have.
I think that's
I,
a really good
yeah.
point. And just to quickly say, I'll give the example of the European Union putting sanctions on some of the Russian media outlets, and there are conversations, is this censoring free speech, et cetera. And it's important to, I think, to your point, come back to um, criteria, actual criteria and standards that media outlets maybe need to meet in order to be uh, seen as a professional outfit. And I think in those cases, we know that those Russian outlets were not meeting those standards, right? So that's another interesting angle, I think, as well. But Andrea, please, I'm sure you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what you're saying. And this comes back to the challenge of AI, right? Because people aren't reading the whole newspaper. If you're getting it from social media, you just see pieces of information. I would argue some of that's not even narratives, right? You supply the narrative and you get a piece of information there. So a lot of this is systemic in the delivery systems by which we get news and not a particular organization. But it makes me think, Pablo, we need a disarm for journalists specifically, right? How we can communicate what it is. But this is the problem, right? And I think journalists, and Pablo talked about this earlier. If we say this is the standard of good journalism, right? Like that kind of opens you up to a lot of critiques. And so, we talk about that a lot in the school. I've got a colleague who's looking at civic influencers and wants to create a green seal of approval for civic influencers, which sounds like a great idea, but trying to operationalize something like that is a total nightmare. But I don't think it means we should stop, right? And I think that goes back to the first point I made is that this environment is so overwhelming. And we need to put some rough drafts out there, really, I think, to say, hey, is this helpful or not?
Yeah, definitely. We've spent a bit of time talking about, academia, the journalism industry. I'd really like to address the private industry as well, because we know that they are, often targeted, and also in this cognitive warfare context, specifically, critical infrastructure companies, companies that specialize in the energy sector, telecommunications, companies that deliver essential services, right? They often get targeted and they undermine that they are then the result is that public confidence in those key sectors is undermined. Um, but then also brands, right? Sometimes even brands, get targeted for ideological reasons. And, we see how manufactured outrage sometimes is created online, accusations of executive harassment or boycotts and things like that. Just wanted to get your thoughts very quickly on the threat targeting, corporate companies and what you think we need to do better in that space. Maybe Pablo, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. No, I think that this is definitely going to be a problem for corporations, right? And if you look at last year's World Economic Forum threat report, regardless of which sector you're in, whether it was, academia or manufacturing or agriculture, mis and disinformation was one of the top three threats for you. So that's coming, and you see it. Um, I always like to pick on agriculture because we all need to eat, right? You look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's like that physical needs, it's right there, it underpins everything, and it's a very emotional subject, right? We're at the holiday season, everybody's going, I can't wait to get home and eat this dish that my family only makes for, the holiday season. Food is something that most of us don't live where our food is grown, right? You talk to kids and it's like, well, food comes in, shrink wrap packaging at the grocery store. And a lot of the food, particularly the fruits and vegetables, the agriculture is shipped from across the world. And what we've seen is a lot of narratives and mis and disinformation about things like pesticides and herbicides, and those things are being used for illegitimate barriers to trade, right? So if you're a corn farmer in Iowa, right, or a soybean farmer in South Carolina, you indirectly are the target of disinformation when you try to ship your products overseas to Asia or to Europe due to a lot of these mis and disinformation narratives around our growing practices. And so this is something that's happening. The first time we publicly spoke about DISARM, and it was actually the predecessor for DISARM. The story we chose to give as an example was a technology company who was falsely accused of giving backdoors in the technology to the U.S. government, and how that would be catastrophic if you were trying to sell your products overseas in Europe. So it's really not hard to take a look around and see what kind of dis and misinformation narratives might be out there that are going to be really harmful to your business. And right now, to your point, Larysa, the being reactive doesn't work, right? It's, the has what's that saying? The lie goes around the world before the truth puts on its pants, something along those lines. So being proactive, if you're a corporation, being proactive about, listen, here are our trade practices, here are our hiring practices, here's how we take care of the environment, here are environmental practices. Here's how we do our corporate governance. If you push those things out ahead of time and you pre-bunk, right? When those disinformation narratives come out, you can just point back to your website, go, listen, we published this 3 years ago. That is absolute nonsense. You can see our reports right here. That hits very differently than if you're trying to play catch up and do damage control after the fact, because now it looks like you're scrambling and you're trying to cover up damage. And so really working with corporate communications and thinking about, what are the disinformation narratives that would really hurt us as an entity, as a corporation, and being proactive about pushing out those narratives ahead of time and being truthful and transparent really goes a long way.
And I'll just add
Definitely.
one quick thing I think that I'd like to see with that is that kind of making a parallel to what I was saying about local journalism, not understanding the context of attacks. I think we need to prepare organizations of all sizes that, it might be a bigger deal than they think it is, right? It's not just this small farming community and soil prices or whatever that it is. And so we may need to consider kind of centralized reporting so we can look for larger trends, right? And that's hard because there's a skill set gap. If we're talking about small businesses, they might not know what to look for. So I think we have to create greater awareness for these issues. So that way, if it is a part of a larger adversarial attack, we have someone that can connect the dots because we might not be able to put them together if they're self-contained in a small organization.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it definitely starts with awareness, right? And I think it's normal that a lot of companies, don't think of themselves as being caught in the middle, of this cognitive war. And a lot of times, we think about this a little bit naively as society, right? Which I think, kind of brings me to my last question, which is, what are the characteristics that you think we need to try to achieve as society in order to build that resilience, whether it's, on the cultural side, perhaps, or, any other, attributes that you think we need to strive for collectively in order to build that layer of resilience. Andrea, how about we start with you?
Sure, this is like the hard multi-million-dollar question. And I'm not going to say media literacy because I feel like that's the default people say, and that's just too hard. There's just too much. So the one thing I would suggest is framing this as an ethics issue, a matter of personal ethics. I think that we have a lot of self-efficacy when we are on social media, whether we retweet or comment on things, and we need to think about the consequences that we as individuals have in this, and we're not passive actors in that. So I think part of that is creating this personal responsibility narrative instead of saying, oh, well, they shouldn't have written it. The story was bad to begin with. We have to shift some of that responsibility to the public.
I think part of it is we need to realize that we're all, fine Americans or fine Europeans or fine whatever. And so if somebody espouses a view that you disagree with, your first duty in order to get to civil discourse is to listen and ask questions and try to understand their viewpoint before you react emotionally. The internet has gotten really, really bad about clickbait and rage bait and those kind of things. And so what I will tell you as a consumer is if you read something or you see something and your first reaction is emotional, you're 100% being manipulated, right? And I'll give a fine example that's not mis or disinformation. Everybody remembers I think it was a PETA ad with the Sarah McLachlan in the arms of an angel, right? Like, okay, great ad, but you were being manipulated for a reason, right? But you should recognize that you're being manipulated. And so you should stop and go, who's giving me this message? What do they want me to get out of the message? What are they trying to get out of me getting, absorbing that belief? And so, that's kind of the more detailed media literacy thing. I think the other one is kind of, we need a larger society discussion about what is a professional journalist? Who do we want to, who do we want to trust natively when they report something? And who do we want to, have a voice, but maybe we look at a little bit more discreetly, right? And maybe we want to evaluate. I think really understanding where our information comes from, who is the actual author, goes a long way. Being more aware of where we are kind of in the Overton window. Ideally, we're in the Overton window. Hopefully, we're not outside the Overton window. Goes a long way. Now, what I will say is I've got a lot of hope. So when I first started working on this in 2017, nobody was talking about defense against mis and disinformation, right? I was, still working for the government at the time. I was still in uniform, and there was no research money for that, right? Nobody wanted to talk about defense. Now we're talking about it on webinars. Now you can turn on the nightly news and hear, news stories about mis and disinformation. My parents asked me about mis and disinformation. So, the first step to solving the problem is recognizing there's a problem and talking about it. And so I think we're starting to make some progress. We just, as a society, need to decide, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable within our own society. What are acceptable controls, if any, on, the First Amendment. Again, I'll go back to nobody's going to tell you you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. You absolutely can, but you're going to be held accountable if there's no fire. Right. And so accountability goes a long way. And I think we just need to have a discussion about what that looks like.
I think that's a great point to end on. And I just wanted to thank both of you, Pablo and Andrea, for your time and for your excellent contributions. It was a really, really fruitful discussion. Um, and thank you all, everybody who's online. Thank you for all the questions that are coming in. Um, just a quick recap, what did we discuss today? The current information environment and the resulting cognitive vulnerabilities that we're seeing, and the importance of defending against these threats, which requires a number of different things that we talked about today. Not only early detection and common language for analysis, but also, this proactivity that needs to be taking place every single day to build trust with our audiences. And here we know that no single sector can act alone. So having that coordination between government, academia, journalists who are on the front line, and also technology organizations that can, help provide, perhaps AI to accelerate some of these workflows and help build trust among audiences. We all need to work together. So thank you again both so much for your contributions, and looking forward to the next discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.